Hello everyone, thank you all for being here today. My name is Chelsea Romulo and I'll be talking to you about conservation workshops in the context of a fruit from the Peruvian Amazon that I've been studying for my dissertation. So I'm going to give you all a little bit of background information about the ecology of this species and the harvest of the fruit, to give you a little bit of context about the conservation workshops. And then I'll get into what those are, and what I mean when I say conservation workshops, and my assessment about what is making them work or not work. So Aguaje is a very tall palm tree that is found throughout the Amazon forest. But in Peru, the fruit are harvested and then sold in large cities and market centers. As you can see in this picture, the racemes of fruit are quite large, almost the size of a full-grown person. And each tree can produce 1 to 6 of these racemes in a year, so that's a lot of fruit. And this fruit, in addition to being harvested by people, is very important for a lot of different animal species, such as these red hipari monkeys. Also, these trees form very dense stands, and the palm forests are really important for a lot of species in terms of habitat. However, in order to harvest the fruit, most people cut down the tree. And this is unsustainable both ecologically and economically speaking because it's a very long-lived species and it's very slow maturing. So recruitment can't keep up with the level of harvest that we have right now. So for my dissertation, I'm actually focusing on the economics of fruit harvest. And in order to understand the market chain, I've been interviewing people that harvest, sell, buy the fruit. This map shows harvester communities in the Peruvian Amazon, which are the little black dots, that collect fruit to be sold in the city of Iquitos, which is shown in the orange box. And Iquitos is a city of about 350,000 people, so a little bit bigger than Madison, but not quite as big as Minneapolis. The labeled cities are the 24 communities that I have visited to conduct my surveys. What I didn't realize that I would find when I started this project is that a lot of these communities are being visited by NGO groups to conduct climbing workshops. And the premise is very simple. The problem is that aguaje is harvested by cutting, and that is unsustainable. So what we're going to do is teach people to climb aguaje trees. It's very straightforward. The format of these workshops are almost identical regardless of what group is teaching the workshop. They come into a community and they spend a couple of days talking about conservation and the importance of the species, and then they get right down to training people how to use the harness and equipment. The method is pretty simple. I've done it myself, and I'm not a professional tree climber or anything like that. So you can pick up the method in a day or two. That's not a problem. However, out of the 24 communities that I have visited, only 2 communities are actually harvesting by climbing. The other 22, universally, everybody in the community cuts down the tree. If we break these down into groups, 9 of the 22 communities that are cutting have not been visited by an NGO, so that makes sense, they've had no training. 5 have only received talks and no practical hands-on training or equipment. But 8 have received full workshops where people are trained and they are given equipment, but they are not climbing trees. So of the other 2 communities, 1 has not been visited by an NGO, but they are climbing trees, and 1 other has received a workshop. And so for today's talk, what I'm really going to be focusing on is what are the differences between the communities that have received workshops and are not climbing, have not changed their harvest method, and the 1 community that is now climbing. And so my research question is what was done differently in that 1 community where people are now climbing trees instead of cutting them down. And so for these methods, I have been interviewing people in the communities who cut down and sell fruit. And I also looked up all of the NGOs that conducted these climbing workshops, and I went and interviewed the project managers in charge of the workshops. So what I'm going to cover right now are what I think are the main differences in terms of the impact of the work. And I've broken these into categories, one of which is equipment, followed by time, monitoring and evaluation, and success. And I'm going to go into each of these categories and talk about them specifically. So the first one is equipment. There are actually 4 different ways of climbing aguaje trees, but regardless of the method and the equipment, the cost is all between about $50 to $75 per set of equipment. And for the most part, that is totally prohibitive for the families that live in this area. The average annual income for a family is about $500. So as you can imagine, spending 10% of your income on equipment for an activity that does not represent your entire income doesn't make any sense. And so pretty much nobody is going to buy this equipment on their own. Because of that, all the NGO groups give equipment to the communities. But the difference between the ones that worked in communities that are still cutting and the one that worked in the community that is now climbing is that only in the climbing community was a set of equipment given to every single family. The idea behind giving few harnesses to the other communities so that they could share it is not actually that unreasonable if you look at how people are climbing. So for the most part, this is not a daily activity. People go out once a week, maybe twice a week, and usually in small groups. So on any given day, there's only 2 or 3 groups of people going out and harvesting aguaje. And so the idea was, well, we'll give each community 2 or 3 sets of harnesses, and they can share. And then that saves costs for the NGO, and perhaps they can visit more communities and spread capacity building even further. However, what I have seen happen in these situations are 2 different things. One is that when we say sharing, that sharing is not actually equitable, and people who are in charge of these equipment only share with their bestest friends and their family. And so then that's not very fair to the people outside of that friend and family group. The other thing that I see is that these poor harnesses suffer kind of a tragedy of the common situation where because they are shared and nobody really owns them, they're not well taken care of and they end up degraded or getting lost very quickly. The next thing I want to talk about is time. And when I say time, there's 2 important aspects to time. One is that this change that happened in the one community did not occur overnight or even in the course of a week or a month. The NGO that has been working there for about 15 years. And so that was a really long time to get to the point where the community has changed their behavior. The second aspect of time is how that time is used. So if you can think to yourself, what might you do when you come to a community and you have a conservation goal like climbing aguaje trees? What is the first thing you're going to do? The first thing that this NGO did was make sure everybody in the community was signed up for the Peruvian version of a social security number. And that is because these communities are living in extreme poverty, and it turns out that it's very hard to think about long-term conservation goals if you cannot feed your family on a daily basis. But with their equivalent of a social security number, they can now receive state benefits so that they're not under so much stress to take care of their families. So what's important here is a diagnostic time period at the beginning of the project to figure out what kind of capacity actually needs to be built in terms of what the community needs. The next thing is monitoring and evaluation. And I asked NGO groups, what do you monitor and when do you monitor? And quite a few of them don't do any kind of monitoring, which means when do you monitor was an irrelevant question. But for the ones that do monitor, they often give a survey at the end of the workshop asking what people learned and if they think that they would implement their new harvest strategy. And universally, people will say, oh, I learned a lot and it was great and I am totally going to do this thing. But what I found when I visited these communities years after they've received a climbing workshop is that they did not actually implement the strategy. So the difference between what they self-reported and what actually happened is a really big deal. But because there was no monitoring in place, these NGO groups couldn't pick that up. What happened in the community that is now climbing is that the NGO group actually built committees of people in the community. And so there are committees, and it's their job in the community to make sure everybody is climbing and everybody has what they need. So if their equipment breaks and they need new equipment, then you have that committee of local community members to go to help you fix your issue. The last thing I want to talk about is success. And I asked all of the NGO groups, how do you define success? And they all gave me totally different answers, which was very interesting. And I've been very careful in this talk not to refer to the communities as successful or not successful communities, because I didn't want to prime you in terms of what success meant. So some NGO groups, and it's even stated like this on their websites, state success in terms of the number of participants of the workshops or number of communities visited. And I think that's a very different number depending on what your goal is. Because if your goal is just to visit communities and present information, then that's a fine metric to use. But if your goal is to get people to change their behaviors, then you have to change your metric of success. So in terms of recommendations based on this work, I think it's really important that we use science, but more importantly, we use the right kind of science. And by that, I mean that I asked all of these NGO groups what kinds of resources they used in order to develop their workshop strategies. And very few of them cited peer-reviewed work. And nobody talked to me about social norms and human behavior or behavior change. But there's a lot of literature available on how to do these things appropriately, but it's not being used. And so because of that, I don't think that we're meeting our conservation objectives in these workshops. So in conclusion, I'd just like to leave you all with the reminder that conservation is not just about managing natural resources, but understanding the cultural, social context in which conservation that we want to occur needs to happen. And I'd like to end with thanking my funding sources and my committee members for all of their support and advising. Thank you. And I think I have time for questions. Okay. Yes?
I'll ask a really stupid question. I work in Southeast Asia, and there's nothing for people to build a bamboo ladder that goes right off palm trees. What in the world is the barrier?
It's because they're so tall. They're 35 meters, 100 feet tall, and so you can use ladders in some cases. So this tree will grow a lot shorter in drier upland areas with a lot of light. But in the lowland swamp areas, it gets really, really tall, and the ground where it likes to live is a swamp. And so it's not stable enough to hold a ladder of the height that you would need to actually reach the fruit. But it is, I mean, it works in very select cases, but in terms of widespread use, it's not practical. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
So you mentioned that the literature on norms and behavior change is not being used by NGOs.
Yeah.
How do you think that is?
I honestly think that they're not aware it exists, because I wasn't even aware it existed until a few years ago. My background is more in field biology and ecology, and so I've only recently, in the past few years, moved into the social science part of conservation. And that's, I don't know what the answer is to that, like how to help people get the resources that are available that they might not even be aware exists.
Yes, I think you are right. I mean, most of the videos are biologists, so they are not and since they don't collaborate too often with social scientists, it's hard for them to get resources.
Any other questions? All right, thank you everyone for your time.